Hi, this is Dr. Long. I want to give a little deeper and clearer understanding of what is meant in the protreptic by the phrase eventums. All right, that is a Latinized stylist type of a term for an event. So I want you to imagine that we are teaching military officers some doctrinal terms. And so the doctrine has evolved over time, and the military college has made some decisions on how to design a specific curriculum to teach that doctrine effectively. And so what they take into account with that curriculum is to express it in the form of lesson plans. Well, we could say that the event in which the education is going to occur, we might think of it as a physical and temporal boundary of a classroom, let's say, or our learning environment, and the curriculum would be one of those players that comes in. The teacher is going to be one of those elements that comes into the event. The learning technology, the infrastructure that is in support of the lesson, is going to come in and be a player in the event. The student, with their baseline, is going to come into the event. And so the event of learning, a scheduled event, incorporates those four elements. But what happens in the practice of teaching is that all four of those elements begin to blend, and then the event itself becomes a player. It becomes a memory. It becomes a thing. The whole is greater than the sum of those four parts. So there is a dynamic element of the event as it is happening in time and space, with consequences based on the interplay of those four different variables. So that's what Kirkeby means about the 6 eventums, that these events are to be seen as dynamic happenings. These are verbs, and they have an identity, all of themselves, that emerges from the mixing of these four variables. Right? So while the event starts off as just a calendar notation, it becomes an artifact, and it has an impact on each of these other variables that were components of the event. And then the student, the person we care about, went in with their baseline, was exposed and participated in the event, and then comes out of there through that experience and becomes a little different than what they were when they first went into that thing, because there's going to be some reflection that occurs from that experience. And then that new student will have updated their baseline based on the experience they just had, plus any other experiences that are going to happen before the next scheduled eventum. And then the sum of all these other learning moments, these learning eventums, each of those have a reflection and a preparation element, all of which are feeding into the student as they are becoming something new each time. So that's the idea behind the eventum in the protreptic, is that it has a certain dynamic quality, although it may start off just as a scheduled event, and we can at least think about what are the major elements that participate in that event, but then realize that the event is its own thing and becomes part of the legacy and the history of the student's teaching path and all of their paths. So one of the things that we want to do with the protreptic is try to understand protreptic is with all of these eventums happening, all of these moving pieces, the idea of the protreptic is to get back to a basic understanding of the most important foundational values and use those as the basis for the major life decisions going forward. That by an appeal and understanding to these permanent values, these values at the identity level, that we can bypass some of the fuzziness and incompleteness and temporality of feelings in the local environmental context. The idea of the protreptic is that we're trying to understand our deep core values. We pull those up out of the mundane into a protreptic session where we can examine them as concepts, and then when we're done with that, get them back into our foundations that are nice, cleaner, and more deeply understood. Then, as these values can penetrate through the feelings and the context, so that our decisions are rooted in our core values and not by ever-changing feelings or local context. That's the idea behind protreptic. So we're dealing at the conceptual level. Now, to get back to our eventum over here with the student, the military officer that we're teaching, you want to realize that today at time zero, this kid came into the service about 10 years ago and lived his life forward, so he's got about 10 years of experience in baseline. And, he has moved from being a company grade officer in command of enlisted soldiers and is now becoming an organizational leader. He's becoming a field grade officer where he's going to be for another at least 10 years. It may be that he becomes a general officer, but that's a pretty small percentage of the force. But he's going to spend all of his career as an organizational leader, as a field grade officer. So it turns out that the faculty that are teaching him, the faculty in this model, have generally retired 5 or 10 or in some cases 20 years ago. And so their view of the Army, and if we say this was simply the date of their retirement, the day they came off of active duty, they had risen to the rank of field grade officer, and now some number of them are retired officers that are civilians. Some of them are more contemporary field grade officers still on active duty, but in every case there is some time difference between their relevant experience and the contemporary experience of the captain promotables and majors that they're teaching. So we have to remember that these officers are being educated, looking forward, so that they can handle all the things that are in their field of vision going forward for at least another 10 and maybe 20 more years. So we're trying to understand what are the relevant experiences and legacy doctrines that go into the curriculum that these teachers are teaching, supported by that technology, expressed in lesson plans, that these students are going to come in with their baseline, experience the event, and then carry that forward. Well, now you can see that this frame of reference, the difference in ages and backgrounds and experiences and the purposes that the student has in learning so they can be prepared for the world ahead, whereas the things that we're teaching them are conditioned by the experiences we've had back in these previous years. And so now the question of relevance is always in the room. What is it that the teachers and the curriculum actually know about this world going forward that we propose to add to the educational event? That's why things like technology and what the students bring in are really important elements of the educational experience going on in the moment. It would be foolish to think that the teachers and the curriculum themselves have the clearest possible vision about what's needed, and then the student take that on trust and be a passive receptacle of the received wisdom? Or do we want to somehow incorporate students and technology in? Because after they leave the event and going forward, the technology will go with the student and the reflection on that lesson, but the technology and the student are the active verbs going forward into the world. And so as we look at the structure of that eventum, we can use this model to help us get clarity on what it is that we want the students to do, what experiences we want them to have, and how we handle this problem of separation in time and space between the relevant knowledge of the faculty and the doctrine and the requirements of the world going forward. So that's what we mean by the eventum, and this is our a useful curriculum model to help us express some of those challenges with the experiences that we're trying to shape and have in the teaching event. Thanks for your kind attention.